cuts beneath the surface. The clinic was a battered remnant of hope in the shadow of the spine. It cut the sky and mirrored so many of the wounds he saw every day. The light filtering through the cracked windows was gray and faint, barely illuminating the makeshift waiting area, which was already full, even though they hadn't opened yet. Inside, the clinic reeked of antiseptic mingled with the damp metallic stench of flooding. Water pooled in corners and seeped under the door, carrying filth from the slum's alleys. It was almost impossible to keep the water out, and there just wasn't the budget for a proper fix. The generator sputtered again, causing the overhead lights to flicker. He hadn't even started working on his first patient of the day, and there were already problems. Dr. Elias Rohn sighed as he set his tools on the tray beside him, his gloves stained red with someone else's blood. Another gang fight. Another young man gutted for something as meaningless as turf. Once the lighting stabilized, he stitched the wound methodically, his fingers steady despite the noise and chaos of the cramped room. He felt the weight of his sidearm under his lab coat. He hated carrying it, but in the slums, violence was always closer than help. Outside, the streets were alive with tension. Voices rose and fell in bursts of anger and desperation. Gunfire cracked sporadically, a grim reminder of the lawless state just beyond the clinic's thin walls. Rohn's time as a soldier had taught him how to distinguish threats from the hum of background violence, but tonight the noise felt sharper, the kind of sharpness that pricked at old instincts. He'd taken the night shift because it was the most dangerous, and he had the most experience of any of the clinicians present to deal with it. Rohn wasn't a hero. He'd given up on that notion years ago. The war had taken pieces of him he couldn't name, leaving behind a man who knew how to take things apart, but found strange solace in putting them back together. His graying hair and hollowed cheeks made him look older than he was, but his eyes burned with an unrelenting focus. His tools were outdated, scavenged from military med kits and the occasional black market haul, but they worked well enough for stitching wounds, draining infections, and resetting bones. The people here didn't care about perfection. They just needed to survive another day, and he gave them that when he could. The clinic door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, cradling a child with a fever. Rohn gestured to the rickety cot against the wall. "Over there, I'll be with you in a minute," he said without looking up. He was still cleaning the blood from his gloves when he noticed the man standing in the doorway, a wiry figure clutching his thigh, his face pale and sweaty. The man's injury caught Rohn's eye immediately. The wound on his leg was long and precise, the edges clean as though sliced by a scalpel. Rohn frowned. This wasn't the jagged tear of a shiv or the uneven hack of a machete. It was deliberate, clinical. "What happened?" Rohn asked, his voice low and even as he motioned for the man to sit. "Don't know," the man muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Woke up bleeding in an alley." "Didn't see who did it?" Rohn pressed. The man shook his head. "Didn't hear or see nothing. Just woke up like this." Rohn crouched by the cot, examining the wound more closely. The cut was deep but avoided any major arteries. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to strike. It wasn't an attempt to kill, it was something else entirely. The thought left a cold weight in his stomach. He stitched the wound quickly, the room silent except for the drip of water from the ceiling and the faint buzz of the generator. The man thanked him, left a handful of crumpled bills, and hobbled out. Rohn watched him disappear into the night, the uneasy feeling settling deeper in his stomach. The following day was much the same. The clinic's doors opened and closed in a steady rhythm, each creak bringing another face etched with desperation and pain. Over the following days, the grim pattern continued to take shape. Patient after patient arrived with similar injuries, clean, surgical cuts that showed more precision than rage. The stories they told, or refused to tell, left an uneasy weight in the air, pressing harder with every case. A scrawny teenager sat on the edge of a cot, his legs swaddled in a blood-soaked rag. His hands trembled as he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. There was "This sound," he said, staring at the floor. "Like a whistle, soft at first, but it got louder. Thought it was someone fooling around. Then, nothing. Woke up like this." He gestured to the wound running along his calf. Roan's frown deepened. The cut was deep enough to cripple, but left tendons and arteries untouched. A calculated injury, not the chaos of a brawl. Another patient, a young woman with hollow eyes, sat hunched in the corner. She refused to meet Roan's gaze, her voice tight with fear. "I saw someone," she murmured. "He was there, then gone, like he got pulled into the shadows. Didn't see what it was. I ran." She shivered violently, hugging herself. Roan pressed for details, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Don't ask me," she hissed. "I don't want to remember." The stories began to stack, their details fractured but eerily consistent. A middle-aged man described waking in an abandoned building, his legs sliced open, blood pooling around him. "Didn't hear a thing," he said, his voice brittle. "Didn't see anyone, just woke up. Thought I was dead." At first, Roan clung to the familiar. Gangs, turf wars, an escalation of violence in a slum already drowning in it. Maybe one of the factions had acquired new tech, blazers or surgical tools, and was testing it in the alleys. He voiced his suspicions to a fellow medic, a weary woman who ran a supply depot nearby. "Escalating," she scoffed, her voice heavy with cynicism. "It's the spine, Roan. Everyone's bleeding from something. Don't get philosophical about it." But the words didn't settle him. The cuts weren't random, nor were they the jagged aftermath of street fights. They were deliberate, methodical. The precision gnawed at him, pulling threads loose in his mind. Each case left his clinic colder, quieter, as though the shadows in the corners had stretched just a little further, and at night when the generator sputtered and the lights dimmed, he swore he could hear it, the faintest hint of a whistle, carried on the stale, damp air. The clinic's lights flickered once, twice, then sputtered out completely. The hum of the generator faltered and died, leaving the room in oppressive silence. Dr. Roan cursed under his breath, fumbling for the flashlight clipped to his belt. The beam cast sharp, shifting shadows across the clinic's worn walls, illuminating rusting medical equipment and the faint sheen of water pooling in the corners. A patient on the cot groaned as Roan threaded a needle, his hand steady despite the dim light. "Hold still," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. The shadows danced with each movement of the flashlight, the needle's glint a stark reminder of the clinic's grim necessities. The muffled sounds of the slum filtered in through the cracked windows, distant shouting, the occasional crack of gunfire, and then something else. A faint, melodic whistle drifted on the stale air, barely audible but distinct enough to make Roan pause. He froze, the flashlight beam shaking slightly as he turned his head toward the sound. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, forcing his focus back to the wound. He didn't believe it, and neither did his patient, who froze at the sound then began shaking slightly. But the whistle lingered in his mind long after it faded, scratching at the edges of his thoughts. Later that night, after the clinic had emptied, Roan sat at his desk. A stack of scribbled notes spread before him. Each patient's name, each injury, each story, he traced the lines with his finger, connecting threads that led to one unsettling conclusion. All the patients with the precise cuts came from the same area, a stretch of the slum near the spine's maintenance tunnels. The tunnels were a forgotten vein of the city, prone to flooding and shrouded in darkness. Authorities rarely ventured there, and the gangs avoided it except for the most desperate pursuits. It was a place where the shadows seemed to stretch longer, where whispers carried further. Roan leaned back, rubbing his temples. His instincts, honed in battlefields far from here, screamed at him to take the pattern seriously. He began asking questions again, subtle at first. Some patients stiffened, their eyes darting toward the windows as if afraid of being overheard. "Don't go there," one man muttered, clutching his freshly bandaged leg. "There's things in the dark." "What things?" Roan pressed. but the man only shook his head, his lips tight. A woman spat on the clinic floor when he mentioned the tunnels. "You don't want to know," she said, her voice trembling. "Just leave it alone." Alone in the clinic, Roan paced the room, his boots splashing through the shallow water on the floor. The whistle he'd heard earlier replayed in his mind, intertwining with the cryptic warnings and the unnervingly precise wounds he'd seen. His thoughts spiraled, tangling with memories of his time as a soldier. He'd seen strange things in war, bodies disassembled with surgical precision, traps set with an intelligence that defied the chaos of battle. Those memories stirred now, rising like ghosts to haunt his waking hours. Was he overthinking it? Was this just another thread of violence in a city fraying at the edges? And that was so long ago. Roan leaned against the counter, staring at his trembling hands. The scars from old battles itched beneath his gloves. He was no stranger to fear, but this felt different. This wasn't the roar of combat or the clash of soldiers. It was something quieter, insidious, a creeping sense of being watched by something unseen, something that waited patiently in the dark. The clinic door slammed open, the harsh sound slicing through the muffled hum of the struggling generator. Roan instinctively reached for his sidearm, his heartbeat quickening. But the figure that staggered in wasn't a threat, at least not an immediate one. The man was wiry, his gaunt frame barely supporting his weight as he stumbled forward, clutching at a makeshift bandage wrapped around his legs. His clothes were torn, soaked with grime and streaked with something that shimmered faintly, an unsettling faint green glow that painted his pale face in sickly hues. Roan caught him before he collapsed, his grip firm despite the man's weight. "Easy," the doctor muttered, dragging him toward the nearest cot. "Sit, don't move." The man's eyes darted wildly, his breath shallow and erratic. "They're in the tunnels," he stammered, his voice hoarse and cracking. Bigger than anything should be." Roan knelt, pulling back the sodden bandage with a practiced hand. His stomach churned. The wounds were brutal, long, surgical cuts that traced the contours of the man's legs. These were far deeper than the injuries he'd treated before, the flesh almost dissected. "What did this to you?" Roan asked, his tone sharper than intended. He didn't expect an answer. Too many of his patients had been too shaken or evasive. But this one was different. The man, Mack, as he later introduced himself, looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "The tunnels," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I was in the tunnels, just looking for wire and such. I've done it 100 times, easy scrap. But this time, saw some things. Wire cut too clean. Though it might be someone with serious connections to get the tools to do that, so I had to go deeper in," and he trailed off, his face twisting in horror. As Dr. Roan cleaned the wounds, Mack began to speak, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I found this patch," he said, staring at the ceiling as though reliving the moment. "A gold mine of wire and capacitors just hanging there. But something was off. I heard this whistling, like wind or pipes. But I was too far underground for that." Roan worked silently, his hands steady as his mind raced. He'd heard a whistling too. "Then I heard it again," Mack continued, his voice trembling. "That whistle. Again. I thought it was the pipes, but it wasn't just noise. It moved like it was alive. And then I saw them." Mack's breathing hitched. "Big, black, oily looking. Their legs, they were like blades, sharp as knives. They moved too fast, too smooth, like machines, but worse. They cut through wire, walls, everything. They saw me, and I ran." His words broke off into a shaky laugh. "I don't even know how I got out. I heard them behind me, made it back to my house, thought I was dead." Roan didn't speak immediately, focusing on stitching the gashes in Mack's legs. But his hands felt heavier with every movement. The pieces clicked into place, each one locking with a weight that pressed on his chest. The precise cuts, the glowing residue, the whistling, everything he'd tried to rationalize over the past weeks now stared him in the face. This wasn't gang violence. It wasn't new weapons or strange tools. It was something else. Something alive. Those things, Roan said finally, his voice low, they've been out there for a while. Mack nodded weakly, his eyes glazed. They're still there, in the tunnels, waiting. The generator flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat. In the distance, faint but audible, a whistling sound rose on the damp air. Roan froze, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. Mack's eyes widened in terror. "They found us," Mack whispered. The clinic's lights gave a final, pitiful flicker before the generator sputtered and fell silent. Darkness consumed the room, oppressive and absolute, broken only by the faint, sickly glow of the bioluminescent residue streaked across Mack's torn clothes. The dim light threw jagged shadows onto the damp walls, twisting and stretching with every movement. Dr. Roan stood motionless, his breath shallow, listening. The clinic, usually alive with distant noise from the streets outside, had fallen into an eerie, suffocating silence. Then it came again. That faint whistle, distant and melodic, drifting through the cracked windows and waterlogged corridors. Mack stirred, his voice trembling. "The generator, I can fix it. We need power back now." Roan hesitated. Every rational thought screamed to stay put, to let the darkness conceal them, but the thought of facing whatever was out there without power was worse. He grabbed his flashlight and nodded. "Let's move." They descended into the basement, the flashlight beam slicing through the black. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the sharp tang of metal and mildew. The flooded floor was slick, and they had to proceed to the basement slower than either of them would have liked. "Let's see what happened," Mack muttered, kneeling by the generator. His hands shook as he inspected the wires, the glow from his clothes casting an unnatural light over the machinery. "Something's cut the cables. Clean? Too clean." Roan's pulse quickened, his eyes scanning the basement. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, flickering along the walls like something alive. The whistling grew louder, clearer. It wasn't random. It carried an eerie, deliberate cadence, rising and falling in chilling harmony. Mack worked faster, his breath ragged. Come on." The water rippled. Roan froze. His flashlight beam darted across the room, landing on the far wall. Something moved. A shape, glossy and black, shifted just out of the light's reach. A soft clicking sound joined the whistling, rhythmic and mechanical. Then it stepped forward. The insect was massive, some 8 feet tall, its glossy shell reflecting the faint bioluminescence of Mack's residue-streaked clothes and the flashlight. Its triangular head tilted, and it paused, as though studying them. Scalpel-like limbs unfolded with an organic, sickening precision, clicking faintly as they scraped against each other. Roan's heart thundered as he raised his sidearm, his finger hovering over the trigger. Behind him, Mack whispered, "Oh no, oh no." More shapes emerged from the shadows, their movements unnervingly fluid. Each one seemed to move in perfect coordination, their limbs cutting precise paths through the water. The whistling shifted, becoming more chaotic, a rising cacophony that filled the air like a living entity. "Run," Roan said, his voice cold and steady despite the fear coursing through him. He stepped backward, his flashlight shaking slightly as the creatures closed in. The largest insect lunged first, its scalpel limbs slicing through the air with terrifying precision. Roan fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked back, glowing fluid spraying across the walls, but another stepped forward to replace it. "We need to move," Mack shouted. The whistling grew deafening, drowning out all thought. The doctor's grip on his sidearm tightened as he and Mack turned and ran, the sound of clicking limbs chasing them through the flooded corridors. The basement became a blur of shadow and chaos as they fled upstairs. The clinic's narrow corridors became a labyrinth of chaos as Dr. Roan and Mack sprinted through the ankle-deep water. The beam from Roan's flashlight wavered wildly, casting fleeting glimpses of glossy black carapaces and scalpel-like limbs slicing through the air. Behind them, the whistling rose to a maddening crescendo, the sound vibrating through the walls and digging into their skulls like nails. "This way," Roan barked, skidding around a corner and shoving open a supply room door. It was just a section of hallway they'd added doors to in an effort to prevent the theft of their rarer items. Mack followed, his face pale and slick with sweat. The doctor slammed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment to catch his breath. The reprieve was short-lived. The sound of claws raking against metal grew closer, punctuated by the occasional crash as something heavy tore through the clinic's fragile walls. "They're tearing the place apart," Mack whispered, clutching his side. "Stay quiet," Roan muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. His mind raced as he mapped out their escape. The creatures were faster, but their precision worked against them. They moved with an unsettling efficiency, but that meant they followed predictable paths. If they could outmaneuver them— The door buckled under a sudden impact, the hinges shrieking. Roan yanked Mack forward. "Move!" He threw the back door open and ran. Mack hobbled behind him. The duo sprinted again, navigating the clinic's twisting halls. Mack tripped, splashing into the water, but Roan hauled him to his feet without stopping. Behind them, the whistling closed in, their scalpel limbs slicing clean through walls and doors. They burst through the clinic's rear exit into the damp, garbage-strewn alleys of the slums. The rain-soaked streets were silent save for their ragged breaths. Roan turned, sidearm raised, but the creatures stopped just inside the clinic's shadowed doorway. The whistling softened, retreating into the clinic as if the creatures were bound to their underground lair. Mack leaned against a wall, his legs trembling. "They're not done," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "They're just waiting." Roan followed Mack's gaze toward the spine. The massive structure loomed above them, its base disappearing into the clouds like a monolith of steel and silence. The realization hit him like a blow. This was only the beginning. The creatures weren't retreating. They were regrouping. "We need to warn them. I have some connections. Let's go," Roan said, his voice grim and steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. He tightened his grip on his sidearm and stared into the endless shadows. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They ran towards the spine. He hoped they'd make it.